I was sick unto death with that long agony. And when they at length unbound me and I was permitted to sit, I felt my senses leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitorial voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. This only for a brief period, for presently I heard no more. I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. I saw them fashion the syllables of my name, and I shuddered because no sound succeeded. And I saw, too, for a few moments of delirious horror, the soft and nearly imperceptible waving of the sable draperies which enwrapped the walls. And then my vision fell to the 7 tall candles on the table. At first they wore the aspect of charity, seemed white and slender angels that would save me, but then, all at once, the angel forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame, and I saw that from them there would be no help. And then the figures of the judges vanished, as if magically from before me. The tall candles sank into nothingness. Their flames went out utterly. All sensations appeared swallowed up in a mad, rushing descent as of the soul into Hades, and then silence, stillness, night, or the universe. I had swooned, but still will not say that all of consciousness was lost. What of it there remained, I will not attempt to define nor even to describe, yet all was not lost. Shadows of memory tell indistinctly of tall figures who lifted and bore me in silence down, down, still down, till a hideous dizziness oppressed me at the mere idea of the interminableness of the descent. After this I call to mind flatness and dampness, and then all is madness, the mere consciousness of existence without thought, a condition which lasted long. So far I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back unbound. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. There I suffered it to remain for many minutes while I strove to imagine where and what I could be. I longed, yet dared not to employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance at objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon things horrible, but that I grew aghast lest there should be nothing to see. At length, with a wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts then were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I still lay quietly and made effort to exercise my reason. I brought to mind the inquisitorial proceedings and attempted from that point to deduce my real condition. The sentence had passed, and it appeared to me that a very long interval of time had since elapsed, yet not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. But where and in what state was I? I at once started to my feet, trembling convulsively in every fiber. I threw my arms above and around me wildly in all directions. I felt nothing. Perspiration burst from every pore and stood in cold, big beads on my forehead. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable, and I stepped cautiously forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in the hope of catching some faint ray of light. Proceeded for many paces, but still all was blackness and vacancy. And now, as I continued to step onward, there came thronging upon my recollection 1,000 vague rumors of the horrors of Toledo. Of the dungeons there had been strange things narrated, too ghastly to repeat save in a whisper. Was I left to perish of starvation in this subterranean world of darkness, or what fate, perhaps even more horrible, awaited me? That the result would be death, and a death of more than customary bitterness, I knew too well the character of my judges to doubt. The mode and the hour were all that occupied or distracted me. My outstretched hands at length encountered a solid obstruction. It was a wall, seemingly of stone masonry, very smooth, slimy, cold. I followed it. This process, however, afforded me no means of ascertaining the dimensions of my dungeon, as I might make its circuit and return to the point whence I set out without being aware of the fact. So perfectly uniform seemed the wall. My clothes had been exchanged for a wrapper of coarse serge. I tore a part of the hem from the robe and laid the fragment at full length and at right angles to the wall. In groping my way around the prison, I could not fail to encounter this rag upon completing the circuit. So at least I thought. But I had not counted upon the extent of the dungeon or upon my own weakness. The ground was moist and slippery, and I staggered onward for some time when I stumbled and fell. My excessive fatigue induced me to remain prostrate, and sleep soon overtook me as I lay. Upon awaking and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher of water. I was too much exhausted to reflect upon this circumstance, but ate and drank with avidity. Shortly after, I resumed my tour around the prison, and with much toil came at length upon the fragment of the serge. Up to the period when I fell, I had counted 52 paces. Upon resuming my walk, I had counted 48 more when I arrived at the rag. There were in all then 100 paces, and admitting 2 paces to the yard, I presumed the dungeon to be 50 yards in circuit. I had met, however, with many angles in the wall, and thus could form no guess at the shape of the vault. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the area of the enclosure. At first I proceeded with extreme caution, for the floor, although seemingly of solid material, was treacherous with slime. At length, however, I took courage and did not hesitate to step firmly, endeavoring to cross in as direct a line as possible. Proceeded some 10 or 12 paces in this manner, when the remnant of the torn hem of my robe became entangled between my legs. I stepped on it and fell violently on my face. My chin rested on the floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head, although at a less elevation than the chin, touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining at the moment. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At length there was a sullen plunge into water, succeeded by loud echoes. At the same time there came a noise resembling the quick opening and as rapid closing of a door overhead, and a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom, and as suddenly faded away. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, congratulated myself at the timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world had seen me no more. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than risk the terrors of the wells, of which my imagination now pictured many in various positions about the dungeon. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many long hours, but at length I again slumbered. Upon awaking, as before, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher of water. A burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the vessel at a draught. It must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk before I became irresistibly drowsy. A deep sleep fell upon me, a sleep like that of death. How long it lasted I know not, but when once again I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible. By a wild, sulphurous luster, I was enabled to see the extent and aspect of the prison. Its size had been greatly mistaken. The whole circuit of its walls did not exceed 25 yards. I'd been deceived too in respect to the shape. In groping my way, I'd found many angles and thus deduced an idea of great irregularity. The angles were simply those of a few slight depressions or niches at odd intervals. The general shape of the room was square. What I had taken for masonry seemed now to be iron, or some other metal in huge plates, whose sutures or joints occasioned the depression. The entire surface of this metallic enclosure was rudely daubed in all the hideous and repulsive figures of fiends, in aspects of menace with skeleton forms and other more fearful images. I observed that the outlines of these monstrosities were sufficiently distinct, yet the colors were faded and blurred as if from the effects of a damp atmosphere. I now noticed the floor, too, which was of stone. In the center yawned the circular pit from whose jaws I had escaped. But it was the only one in the dungeon. All this I saw indistinctly and with much effort, for my personal condition had been greatly changed during slumber. I now lay upon my back on a low framework of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap which passed in many convolutions about my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head and my left arm, to such extent that I could, with much exertion, supply myself with food from an earthen dish which lay by my side on the floor. I saw to my horror that the pitcher had been removed. I say to my horror, for I was consumed with intolerable thirst. And this thirst it appeared to be the object of my persecutors to stimulate, for the food in the dish was meat, pungently seasoned. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead, constructed much as the side walls. In one of its panels, a very singular figure riveted my whole attention. It was the painted figure of Time, as he is commonly represented, save that, in lieu of a scythe, he held what appeared to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. There was something about this that caused me to regard it more attentively. While I gazed directly upward at it, for its position was immediately above my own, I fancied that I saw it in motion. A moment later, the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief, of course slow. Slight noise attracted my notice, and looking to the floor, I saw several enormous rats. They had issued from the well, which lay just within view to my right. While I gazed, they came up in troops hurriedly, with ravenous eyes, allured by the scent of the meat. From this it took much effort and attention to scare them away. It might have been half an hour, perhaps even an hour, before I again cast my eyes upward. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent by nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, its velocity was also much greater, but what mainly disturbed me was that it had descended. I now observed that its nether extremity was formed of a crescent of glittering steel, about a foot in length from horn to horn, the horns upward, and the upper edge evidently as keen as that of a razor. Like a razor also, it seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid and broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass, and the whole, as it swung through the air, inch by inch, line by line, with the descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages, down and still down it came. Days passed. It might have been that many days passed ere it swept so closely over me as to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful scimitar. And then I fell suddenly calm. and lay smiling at the glittering death like a child at some rare bauble. Even amid the agonies, the human nature craves food. With painful effort, I outstretched my arm as far as my bonds permitted and took possession of the small remnant which had been spared me by the rats. As I put a portion of it within my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. But what you said, I have hope. In vain I struggled to regain it. Long suffering had nearly annihilated all my ordinary powers of mind. I was an imbecile, an idiot. The vibration of the pendulum was at right angles to my length. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of the heart. It would fray my robe. It would return and repeat its operations again and again. Oh, I dared not go farther than this reflection, but down, steadily, down it crept. Down, certainly, relentlessly down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. I struggled violently, furiously to free my left arm. This was free only from the elbow to the hand. I could reach from the platter beside me to my mouth with great effort, but no further. Down, still unceasingly, still inevitably down. I gasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrunk convulsively at its every sweep. My eyes followed its outward and upward whirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair and closed themselves spasmodically at the descent. Oh, death would have been a relief. I saw that some 10 or 12 vibrations would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe, and with this observation, there suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. It now occurred to me that the bandage which enveloped me was unique. I was tied by no separate cord. The first stroke of the razor-like crescent across any portion of the band would so detach it that it might be unwound from my person by means of my left hand. But how fearful in that case the proximity of the steel, the result of the slightest struggle, how deadly. Was it probable that the bandage crossed my bosom in the track of the pendulum? I so far elevated my head as to obtain a distinct view of my breast. The band enveloped my limbs and body close in all directions, save in the path of the destroying crescent. Scarcely had I dropped my head back to its original position when there flashed upon my mind what I cannot better describe than as the unformed half of that idea of deliverance to which I have previously alluded, and of which a moiety only floated indeterminately through my brain as I raised food to my burning lips. The whole thought was now present, feeble, scarcely sane, scarcely definite, but still entire. For many hours, the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited but for motionlessness on my part to make me their prey. To what food, I thought, have they been accustomed in the well? They had devoured, in spite of all of my efforts to prevent them, all but a small portion of the contents of the dish. With the particles of the oily and spicy viand which now remained, I thoroughly rubbed the bandage wherever I could reach it, and then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals seemed startled and terrified at the cessation of movement. They shrank alarmedly back. Many sought the well. Oh, this was only for a moment. Observing that I remained without motion, a few of the boldest leaped upon the frame, and this seemed a signal for a general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood and overran it and leaped in hundreds upon my person. The measured motion of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves with the anointed bandage. They pressed, swarmed upon me in ever-accumulating heaps. They writhed upon my throat, their cold lips sought my own. I was half-stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust for which the world has no name swelled my bosom and filled with a heavy clamminess my heart. Yet one moment, and I felt the struggle would be over. Plainly I perceived the loosening of the bandage. I knew that in more than one place it must already be severed. With more than a human resolution, I lay still. At length I felt I was free. The bandage hung in ribbons from my body, but the stroke of the pendulum had already pressed upon my bosom. It had divided the serge of my robe, and it had cut through the linen beneath. Twice again it swung, and a sharp sense of pain shot through every nerve. But the moment of escape had arrived. With a wave of my hand, my deliverers hurried tumultuously away, and with a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow, I slid from the embrace of the bandage and beyond the reach of the scimitar. For the moment, at least, I was free. Scarcely had I stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor of the prison when the motion of the hellish machine ceased, and I beheld it drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. My every motion was undoubtedly watched. I glanced nervously around at the barriers of iron that hemmed me in. I became aware for the first time of the sulphurous glow which illumined the cell. It proceeded from a fissure, about half an inch in width, extending entirely around the prison at the base of the walls, which thus appeared, and so were, completely separated from the floor. I endeavored, of course in vain, to look through the aperture. But as I arose from the attempt, the mystery of the alteration in the chamber broke at once upon my understanding. I have observed that although the outlines of the figures upon the walls were sufficiently distinct, yet the colors seemed blurred and indefinite. These colors had now taken on a startling and most intense brilliancy that gave to the spectral and fiendish portraitures an aspect that might have thrilled even firmer nerves than my own. Demon eyes glared upon me in 1,000 directions where none had been visible before, and gleamed with a lurid luster. Fire. There came to my nostrils the breath of the vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in the eyes that glared upon my agonies. I gasped. I panted for breath. There could be no doubt of the design of my tormentors. Amid the thought of the fiery destruction that now impended, the idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like balm. I rushed to its deadly brink. I threw my straining vision below. The glare from the enkindled roof illumined its inmost recesses. Yet, for a wild moment did my spirit refuse to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length it forced it. It wrestled its way into my soul. It burned itself in upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for a voice to speak! Horror! Any horror but this! Ah! The shriek! I rushed to the margin and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat rapidly increased, and once again I looked up. There had been a second change in the cell. The room had been square. I now observed that 2 of its iron angles were now acute and 2 consequently obtuse. The fearful difference quickly increased with the low rumbling or moaning sound. In an instant, the apartment had shifted its form into that of a lozenge. But the alteration stopped not here. I neither hoped nor desired it to stop. I could have clasped the red walls to my bosom as a garment of eternal peace. Death, I said, any death but that of the pit! Fool! Might I have not known that into the pit it was the object of the burning iron to urge me? Could I resist its glow, or if even that, could I withstand its pressure? And now, flatter and flatter grew the lozenge with a rapidity that left me no time for contemplation. Its center, and of course its greatest width, came just over the yawning gulf. I shrank back, but the closing walls pressed me onward. At length, from my seared and writhing body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered upon the brink. I averted my eyes. There was a discordant hum of human voices, a loud blast as of many trumpets, harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back, and an outstretched arm caught my own as I fell fainting into the abyss. It was that of General Lasalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies.